For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, with the latest readout video from our free Wednesday Wake Up newsletter, to which you should subscribe. And also please, if you're watching this video, but you aren't already a subscriber to our YouTube or Rumble channel, click that button too, because it's very important to our growth. And I'm also here with some startling news from the doomed Franklin expedition that it's cold in winter in the Arctic. Apparently it's hot. An excited Canadian press story about the recovery of artifacts from the shipwrecked Erebus and Terror slipped in the claim that, quote, climate change, however, is shifting the terms of the work. Less sea ice means the wrecks are more vulnerable to waves and currents generated by winter storms, end quote. Which is one more example of the way in which the climate cult can't be bothered to check mere facts anymore, since Arctic ice has actually been rebounding lately and is higher than it's been at this time of year for any point in the last 20 years. Meanwhile, since those ships were lost in 1848 off King William Island in Nunavut, the Arctic has been navigable on at least two occasions, once in the very early 20th century and once in the mid-20th century. So, are the waves and currents worse today because they're climaty than the ones were in the 1940s or 1900s that were just weather? Of course they were. Everybody knows that. Even though, if you actually look at a map, and even journalists can in theory do a bit of background research, the area in question is among the most ice-locked in the entire Arctic. Still, from the other pole, we hear of an alarming loss of Antarctic ice. Just not recently. CNN blares that, quote, scientists discover an alarming change in Antarctica's past that could spell devastating future sea level rise, end quote. Which is the sort of thing the scientists involved have to say when they're looking for a grant, even when what they found happened a long time ago, as in this case. See, what they supposedly found is that, quote, evidence from a 2,000-foot-long ice core reveals that the West Antarctic ice sheet shrank suddenly and dramatically around 8,000 years ago, according to new research, providing an alarming insight into how quickly Antarctic ice could melt and send sea levels soaring, end quote. Of course, the fact that they've discovered massive climate instability long before humans had any influence on it actually proves that climate instability is normal, even if scary, so it's foolish to assume that the most recent trivial changes prove that we are responsible, as if, until now, climate never changed. It just sat there, cool and benevolent. But admitting that climate has always been unstable would never do. As it would apparently also be unseemly to mention that Western Antarctica seems to have been cooling for 4,000 years, as the Holocene climatic optimum gradually cycles downward toward the next glaciation. But we mention it anyway. And not, I should repeat here, to say, look, climate is naturally variable, so don't worry. On the contrary, at CDN we repeatedly emphasize the crucial importance of resilience, of making sure that our economies are strong, because any sudden change in climate, from a return of the glaciers to the melting of a major ice sheet, would strain our resources to the limit. And so our main objection to the claim that whatever has happened in the last 150 years must be human-caused because climate is naturally stable is that all the evidence points the other way, including this new stuff. Sudden climate changes are the rule, not the exception, and we really want to be ready for the next one, whatever it is. And in this vein, the Epoch Times notes that, quote, UN says melting Arctic ice is key indicator of climate change, but it's not melting, end quote. Whereas The Guardian asks, quote, pumped up, will a Dutch startup's plan to restore Arctic sea ice work, end quote? To which we reply, no, of course not. But in any case, it's restoring itself, so what's the point? Hey, you 40%ers. I know you're out there. You're the 40% who are watching but haven't yet subscribed to the channel. And I want to ask you, please, to click this button and get us from 84,000 to 100,000 subscribers in the next 2 months. It doesn't cost you anything. It helps us grow the Climate Discussion Nexus, and it helps protect us against getting deplatformed. So just click here, and we'll get back to the show. And then, from the Climate Backlash file via the Wall Street Journal, we learned that in the UK, after a plan to flat-out ban gas water heaters, which Britons call boilers, was quashed by angry British citizens, the government required that heat pumps had to replace 4% of annual boiler sales, or the companies would be fined £3,000 per excess boiler sold. But for once, Canadian companies take note, industry fought back, warning consumers that they'd end up paying a premium as the fines were absorbed by the companies and then added to the price of boilers. And after lashing out at the firms for being economically rational, Britain's Conservative government caved in. So stand by on car lots and electric vehicles. Also, Blacklock's reporter announces that in Canada, quote, a federal climate program to phase out oil furnaces has seen only 80 homeowners convert to greener energy nationwide, records show, end quote. So, apparently the politicians can fix the weather and redesign the economy, they just can't get 100 families to buy new furnaces. And again from Blacklock's, quote, small business has yet to see billions in promised carbon tax rebates, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business said yesterday, end quote. So, even designing a tax handout is indescribably hard and slow for the people running Canada, but fixing the weather is dead simple. And one rule of climate change journal activist science is that anything, no matter how small or tentative, can be reported as proof that we're wrecking the planet, but nothing can ever be cited as potential evidence that we're helping it. Every impact of warming has to be bad, QED. And so, quote, in Quebec's strawberry fields, a tiny insect may forecast big climate impacts, study, end quote. Yeah, but only if farmers forget everything they've ever known about how to grow crops, which, to be fair, most journalists never knew anyway. Also, it seems that the climate is so incredibly fragile that, should it warm ever so slightly, you will no longer get, quote, Norwegian salmon, oysters, lamb, fingerling potatoes, sticky toffee pudding, end quote, or for that matter, coffee, chocolate, or wine in a fancy restaurant. So says one Sam Cass, who is, quote, former White House chef and political advisor to President Barack Obama, end quote, which seems to us to be a strange combination as well as a surprisingly dangerous one. Anyway, Cass dreamed up a list of menu items that are supposedly endangered by climate change as a publicity stunt to, convince ordinary people to take the climate crisis seriously. Yep, all those ordinary people who are worried about not being able to order the fingerling potatoes with their Norwegian salmon next time they're out for a night on the town with consultants. Now, we don't want to spoil the mood of elegant panic, but we do want to ask you, where was your morning coffee grown? Was it Baffin Island? Norway, perhaps? Maybe Alaska? How strange. It was grown in Central America, or Central Africa, or Indonesia, or somewhere else warm, having admittedly first been drunk in the Arctic wastes of Yemen. See, Coffea arabica is actually currently listed as endangered, quote, although it presently has a huge wild population of 13.5 to 19.5 billion individuals throughout its native range, end quote, which seems like a lot to those of us not in the environmental panic game. Moreover, the family Rubiaceae, to which coffee belongs, appears to have evolved roughly 50 million years ago during the Eocene epoch, which, as any good democracy reporter focused on misinformation will not know, was a lot warmer than the current Holocene. And Coffea arabica, aka the good stuff, seems to have appeared between 500,000 and 1 million years ago, but as a hybrid of two other existing coffees due to, quote, changing environmental conditions in East Africa, end quote, way before humans caused weather to become unstable. So, this silly notion that a small increase in temperature will wipe coffee from the planet is, well, silly. As a matter of fact, Wikipedia claims that, quote, in 2020, the world production of green coffee beans was 175,647,060 kilogram bags, led by Brazil with 39% of the total, followed by Vietnam, Colombia, and Indonesia, end quote. And, despite the appalling climate crisis killing everything, that number's up from 105 million of these bags in 2004. And in 1950, when temperatures were better according to some people, it was just 36 million. So, rumors of coffee's impending extinction are the result of twitchy nerves. Maybe switch to decaf. And we did check, and grapes, oysters, and so on are also doing just fine, partly because they too evolved and flourished on a much warmer planet. And if only reporters had Google on their computers, they too could learn such fascinating and arguably relevant things, including that chocolate is generally grown in warm places like Africa, not cold ones like Greenland. In the newsletter, we also introduce you to SpongeBob Climate Scientist, in the form of a new study saying, of all things, that the settled science indicates that warming is happening even faster than thermometers can read or science could predict, and, quote, time is running out, end quote. As it always seems to be doing, as if training for a marathon that never actually starts. This time it's ancient sea sponges telling us what the thermometer refuses to say, but the models demand. Fully 6 of them, which supposedly recorded modern warming better than all the thermometers, satellites, and weather balloons put together, and also recorded acidity and carbon dioxide levels in the air. So, one output from 6 specimens gives us decisive insight into 3 inputs. Case closed. And in our ongoing Getting Worse series, we consider examples of weather and climate extremes that we're told are getting worse and worse, and then we compare these claims to data. This week, we look at weather disasters in Europe with a tip of the hat to Roger Pilkey Jr., who wrote about it on his Substack blog. Not that EU politicians are the only ones out there claiming that weather hazards are getting worse, but they do seem to be particularly vocal about it. And unfortunately for them, but fortunately for everyone they govern, the truth is not what they think. Now, it's true, if you simply plot up the value of weather-related disasters year by year, then yes, there is an upward trend since 1980. But the thing is that since 1980, there have been a lot of buildings built, and a lot of cars, equipment, and other things accumulated, and they're often fancier than the 1980 model. So, the same number of storms could do a lot more damage now because there's a lot more stuff to get damaged, and a lot of it is more expensive. The real test is whether damages have grown as a fraction of the size of the economy. And that trend is downward. It's not getting worse, it's getting better. In the newsletter, we also look at a paper by Dr. Roy Spencer of the University of Alabama. He's one of the developers of the celebrated technique for measuring atmospheric temperatures using microwave sounding units on satellites. He blogs at drroyspencer.com, and this paper's on models versus observations. And its key point, and this is so critical when you're given this pseudo-precision in so many areas of the climate crisis, is that the energy imbalance in the atmosphere that's supposedly caused by man-made greenhouse gases is actually smaller than the measurement error of the system used to measure it. So basically, what we have isn't data, it's noise. But that noise is then fed into computer models that are very good at turning noise into scary warming because the programmers told them to, including by building in the assumption that climate is naturally stable unless some outside forcing makes it wobble, which then turns any natural fluctuation into proof of human vandalism, whereas in point of fact, what all the evidence is telling us is that climate has always fluctuated naturally, which calls into question the claim that humans are responsible for the latest example. Finally, from the co2science.org archive, we have a look at atmospheric blocking, a mid-latitude weather phenomenon that, like much else in the real world, flummoxes those fabled models. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and I'll believe the Arctic is melting when the Arctic believes it.